Hey darts fans, it's Timo Newman here, the transporter. Welcome to the good ship Undarted Waters. And what are we now? I believe this is the 4th episode of this series on the secrets of the dartboard. I was just pretending to be my friend Tony because Tony throws random darts. And if you let Tony throw just at the 20 segment, which is what we looked at yesterday, sometimes Tony will score 140 like that. He'll go tops, trebles, tops. And I don't think really any human would choose to do that, right? If you had a 140 checkout, I don't think you'd take it that way. But anyway, Tony, you see, Tony just throws random darts. So Tony does not have prejudice. You know, I don't mean that in a bad way, but he doesn't have bias in what he does on the dartboard. He just throws randomly. A lot of it is pretty second rate, but sometimes it's pretty cool. Now, an amazing fact that I told you about Tony yesterday is that when Tony is aiming at the 20 segment... Oh, I don't have a whiteboard. Right. Turn off the light. Get the whiteboard. You can't write on a music stand. Right, there we go. So Tony... We looked at Tony, who is my computer program that throws random darts, but what you find is that he, if he's throwing at the 20 segment, has an average which is surprisingly high, 75.6 average on the 20 segment. Okay. So to me, that's quite a humbling number because that's like in 10 visits, we could measure our average on the 20 segment. You could sort of take 10 visits at the 20 segment, throw your 30 darts, divide by 10, and that will give you your kind of per visit average. Getting 756 points in 10 visits on the 20 segment is just not easy. But that's what a blindfold player does, so long as you just let his darts land in the 20 segment. I know it's artificial, but obviously Tony's just a computer program, okay? So we can sort of make that computer program do artificial things. And the point of doing those artificial things, though, is to give us a baseline. I think I call Tony like a null model, which is what we have in science when we want a baseline so that we can compare reality to that and learn what the difference means, okay? Now, the average, you hear that word a lot in science, and you also hear it in the newspapers. You hear politicians say average quite a lot as well. Depending on who's telling you the word average, you either should be either moderately skeptical or very skeptical. You should never be not skeptical, because the word average is kind of like a big blanket that you can throw over data and give a very boring kind of characterization of that data by saying, oh yes, well the average size of earth tremors in the world is blah blah blah. Well, yeah, a lot of those are really small, and some of them are so big they are horrendous earthquakes. So the average in that situation there is kind of meaningless, actually, because you don't care about the earth tremors you don't feel, you care about the earthquakes. But the average size of an earth tremor tells you nothing about that. Or a politician might say, oh, the average rate of inflation over the 5 years of our government has been 3%. But if currently it's 20%, that's a problem. So people often use the word average to hide things, okay? So whenever someone says the word average, like Timo Newman, right, says, oh, Tony's average is 75.6. Well, be a bit skeptical of that. But the thing is, we can actually look underneath this and say, well, what's Tony really doing to get that average? And that's really the subject of today's video. Now, I've actually redone all my calculations from last year about this, because the results are pretty cool, but it requires quite a lot of work. And I didn't want to give you things that haven't been checked. So I've checked everything. It all works out. And it's actually really fun. So part of me wants to give an hour-long lecture taking you through this, because it's actually quite a fun thing to work through. But most of my viewers, I don't think, would want to sit through an hour of me doing probability theory, okay? So we'll skip that, and I'll just give you the main results, but I will give you a taste of how you work this stuff out first. Now, a lot of this might seem a little bit dry at first, but actually there are some very good take-home messages from this, I promise. So, as happens with a lot of science, particularly in physics, I feel, even though we often ask quite abstract questions, we find things that are very relevant to the real world, into everyday life, which are very useful. So let me just give you a sense of how we look underneath the average. Okay, and then I'll give you the results. I won't take you through all the calculations. If anyone's interested though, I'm happy to do that in the future, right? If I've got technical viewers who'd like to see that, no problem. Nothing on this channel is ever hidden, but we try to do things in a way that uses the viewer's time respectfully. I respect your time and your support. Okay, so Tony is throwing 3 random darts at the 20 segment, okay? Now, what can happen when he does that? Well, he might score single, 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 and I'm not writing these in any particular order, by the way, okay? But he might score 3 singles, or one of his darts might hit a double, or 2 of his darts might hit doubles. He might hit a treble with one of his 3 darts. He might hit 2 trebles. He might hit, let's see, a double and a treble along with that single. And these are all the possible things that could happen where Tony has at least 1 single. But he might get 3 doubles, or he might get 2 doubles and a treble, or he might get a double and 2 trebles, or he might get 3 trebles. And those 10 possibilities are all the different things that could happen, but I'm not caring about the order, dart 1, dart 2, dart 3, just what did the 3 darts do. These are the 10 possibilities. And we know the probability of any one of these things happening, like a single, a double, or a treble, because we worked out the area of the segment of the regions of the 20 segment. So the probability of Tony getting a single, remember, was 81. No, what was it? Sorry, 81.1. Yes, 81.1%. Sorry, I was freezing up then because I was thinking about the big single, but this is the big single plus the small single. 81.1%. The probability of a double is 11.8%, and the probability of a treble is 7.1%. So those are all the things that we worked out from the geometry of the dartboard. Let's just check that those add up to 100%. So 81.1, 92.9, 91.92.9, 93, yeah, 100. Okay, we're all good, 100%. So this is what you do then for this calculation. I won't go through it, but just so you know sort of what's under the hood here. So you might say, well, what's the probability of getting single, single, double? You multiply the probability of a single by the probability of a single, and then probability of a double. I'm sorry, this red pen's not very, doesn't stand out very well. So you just multiply these 3 numbers together. So you turn them into decimals. So you'd call that 0.811. This is 0.118, which is cute because they're like mirrors of each other. And 0.071 are the decimals of those percentages. You multiply them together, and you mustn't forget what's called the combinatorics. There's 3 different ways this could happen. He could get the double on the first dart, the second dart, or the third dart. So we multiply this by 3. And that number would be the probability of Tony getting a single, and a double, which is the only way, by the way, that he can score 80 with his 3 darts, because he doesn't get bounce outs because he's got an ideal dartboard, okay? So you do that for all of these 10 possibilities and work out all the numbers, and let me give you the results. So let's get rid of all this. But that's what's under the hood, okay? And let's just make a table of all the results now. And we're going to find some interesting things here. I'm going to change my glasses over to my reading glasses so I can see my notes. But it means I won't be able to see much else, okay? Right. I want to make a table where I have the score and then Tony's chance of getting that. So how often does this occur? I also want to work out what weight does that give to Tony's average, okay? And you'll see what I mean by that in a minute. Remember, his average is 75.6. And then I'll just give the odds as well, like roughly how many goes does he have to get that score. And the possible scores that Tony can get are 60, 80, 100, 120, 140, 160 and 180, right? Is there a way that I can't hold the board and look at my notes at the same time? Sorry about this. Right, so he gets the 60, 50, I'm just going to round up, okay, so 53% of the time he gets the 60, and 23% of the time he gets an 80, and then he gets a ton 17% of the time, and then it drops off after this. So this is already, I think this is already pretty interesting, by the way. I'm going to start talking about this in a second. Let me just finish this column. So he gets a 124% of the time, he gets a 142% of the time, and then it really drops off up here, and it's quite hard to write these numbers. So basically it's like 0.2% of the time he gets a 160, and then it's 0.04. So the 180 is, of course, obviously very, very, very rare. But let's just already look at this first column. So this is what comes out of the calculation. I'll put my proper glasses back on. Oh, right. I need a slurp of tea as well, sorry. Right, now look. I think already this is kind of interesting. So if you throw random darts at the 20 segment, you might think that most of the time you're going to get a 60. And by most I mean sort of like a lot of the time. Because the single is such a big part of the board. The single is over 80% of that segment. So you might think, oh, if I throw 3 darts into that, I'm just going to get lots and lots of 60s. But it's not actually the case. Roughly speaking, Tony only gets a 60 half the time. Isn't that kind of curious? And you might say, well, why is that? And you can actually work it out using probabilities, because you can say, well, in order to get a 60, I've got to get a single, and a single. And if the probability of a single is 80%, that's 0.8. And so if you multiply 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8, you get roughly a half, because 8 8s are 64 and 8 6s are 48. So you can see you roughly get 50% from multiplying 0.8 by itself 3 times. So this is kind of some of the beauty of probabilities, is that when you have multiple events that have certain probabilities, sometimes the outcome is a bit different to what you might think. So Tony, roughly half the time, does better than 60, and that's why his average is so good. His average is 75.6. A quarter of the time he gets an 80, and that's my push for the double for scoring. Tony is not prejudiced against the double. He uses the double, in quotation marks, for his scoring. And the double is a pretty big region. It's over 10% of the segment. That's a good scoring region. Tony uses that and he gets 80 a quarter of the time from random darts. He gets a ton about a fifth of the time. And he gets a ton in two different ways. He gets a ton as treble, single, single, but he also gets a ton from double, single, double, right? And you can work out that those two roots to a ton, he gets the treble, single, single 4 times more often than he gets the double, single, double. Okay, because obviously the singles are big regions, so it's easier to get 2 singles and then something rather than two doubles and something. Okay, but then there's a cliff. I think this is a really interesting thing. There's a cliff, then it just falls off. Suddenly you got all these big proportions of his scoring, and then this is all like really small. So it's very hard for Tony to get a 120, only 4%. Okay, and again the 120 will have the Shanghai and then the 3 double tops, and sorry, 3 double top. Now getting the 3 double top for this 120, he only does that 24 times less often than the Shanghai treble, single, double. So that fancy de Souza shot of double top, double top, double top, which I sometimes do to start my videos for a laugh, that is only 1/25th of the way Tony gets 120. 24 times out of 25 he does it by Shanghai. That's pretty interesting. The 140 drops right off. I did that funny 140 there of the double, treble, double, which again is 4 times less often used by Tony compared to the treble, treble, single. Okay, so basically one of the things we learned from this is that the probability of a single times a treble is 4 times bigger than the probability of a double times a double. So single treble is a kind of more powerful than double double. Okay, forgetting these things. And then very, very tiny numbers for the 160 and the 180. Okay, but let me just write this other column, because what you can ask is, even though I get 53% of the time, how much weight does that give to this average? Because the average is composed of how often you get a 60, how often you get an 80, how often a 100 and all that. But the bigger the score, it kind of has more weight because you're adding a bigger number in, even though it's less frequent. So the weight that a certain score gives to the average is not the same as its occurrence. So we can work out the weights that these give. And this is kind of important. So what you find is that the 60 is only giving 42% to the actual average in terms of the weight of it, because it's the smallest number you can get with 3 darts is 60. The 80 is 25%, and then the 100 is 23%. And then after that, again, it drops off pretty quickly. So the 120 is 7%, the 140 is 3%, and then these are really small, basically 0.3 and 0.1, really tiny. So I'm not putting all the decimal places in here. I just want to give you the kind of the overall picture. But why am I including this column? I think because what I want you to see from this one is that even though Tony gets 60 the most often, over half the time he gets a 60, just a bit over half, but it only contributes about 40% to his average score. So it's underrepresented in his average. Okay, so you're losing 11 percentage points here in terms of how frequently it occurs compared to how much it actually helps your scoring. This one is roughly the same, but this one is really interesting. The ton is the one that's kind of boosted most in terms of how many percentage points it gives to your average. So I think this kind of, in a way, mirrors, I think, dart players' intuition that a ton is like a really wholesome, good score to get. It's like people are very satisfied with a ton. And even though Tony gets a ton 17% of the time, it contributes almost a quarter to his average score. So it works hardest for you in a way. I think the ton is the number that works hardest for you in building up your average score. So I think that's quite an interesting feature. And then we can last of all just write down the odds here. So you get a 60 roughly 1 in 2 times, or sorry, Tony does. Roughly 1 in 2 times he gets a 60. This is roughly 1 in 4 times he gets an 80. He gets a ton roughly 1 in 6 times. And that's pretty surprising, right? For a blindfold player who's hitting the 20 segment, 1 in 6 visits is a ton. Okay? And then it drops off the cliff then. So 1 in 24 times he gets a 120. 1 in 66 times he gets a 140. 1 in 562 visits he gets a 160. And then finally 1 in 2,794 visits he gets a 180. Okay. You have to let Tony play for a while for him to get a 180, but he will get one. Okay. But again, you see this kind of cliff here. I think this is really interesting. I mean, what Tony's kind of demonstrating here is that sort of Tony in a way kind of focuses, I mean, he's a random, I mean, it's random, but I'm personifying Tony here because I think I want Tony to kind of teach us, okay? And he's saying there's kind of a cliff. Anything above 100 at this level of darts that Tony plays, i.e. getting a scoring average of 75.6, anything over a ton is kind of nice, but it's kind of a bonus. But the meat and potatoes is the ton and the 80. But we don't go for 80s. We're missing out on this whole piece here as dart players. Tony is quite happy to go single, single, double. Okay, he does that quarter of the time to get his average of 75. Really interesting. So I'm just going to do one last thing and then we'll close this off because there's so much more one can say about this, but let's just take all this away. I want to just do one last thing here. I want to work out how long does Tony have to play if he was a human to get his 180. So we just saw there that his odds for a 180 were 1 in 2,794. Okay. And I have to let you into a secret. Why is Tony called Tony? It's because his real name is this. Okay, that's his real name. So it's not surprising we're looking at a 180 here for Tony. So I think, you know, when I measure how I'm not the fastest player, but I think for me, one visit is about 15 seconds. And so we can ask, how long would I have to play if Tony played the same speed as me, one visit every 15 seconds. Now Tony throws 100 million darts in 1 second on my old laptop. This is the beauty of computers, right? They're dumb, but they're really fast. And don't get me on the topic of AI, please, because that's us being dumb with things that should be kept dumb. But that's another story, right? But my old laptop can do 100... Tony can do 100 million darts in 1 second. Let's slow him down a wee bit to Timo Newman pace. So one visit in 15 seconds, all right? And then let's work out how long it takes Tony to get a 180. Now you don't just multiply 15 seconds by this number, because Tony might get that 180 on his first go, because it's all random. So the way we do this is we ask how many visits, so the number of visits for Tony to have a 50% chance of having his 180, okay? And that turns out to be 1,937. There's a way in maths that you do this. If technically what you do is you multiply this by the logarithm of 2, okay? And you can demonstrate why that's the right thing to do. But for him to have a 50% chance of succeeding, he needs this many visits. And when you multiply that by 15 seconds, what you find is it's just over 8 hours. It's 8.1 hours. And that's worth a few exclamation points, I think. So Tony, who throws random darts, okay, at the 20 segment, will get a 180 every 8 hours if he plays at a kind of a regular, normal human pace. Now, you know, I've got pals who would love to get a 180, you know, and they're interested in darts. Maybe they're not like playing all the time and trying to get better and better, but, you know, there are folks who've played for a number of years who've never scored a 180 and they would love to get a 180. But what happens is that psychology gets in the way. They might occasionally get a 60, a treble 20, and then that third dart just tense up. And if you tense up, it's very, very hard, right? You're just going to go into the 5, or it's going to be a wild throw, and it will not be in the treble 20 segment. So psychology keeps us in all levels of darts from playing at our best. And again, this kind of null model of darts that Tony represents teaches us that the 180, although rare, is not that rare. So if Tony plays at the rate of an average player, he just throws random darts at the 20 segment. Every 8 hours, he will score a 180. Okay. And you might object to the fact that he always hits the 20 segment, but let's just say he only hits the 20 segment, you know, only gets all 3 darts in the 20 segment every 10th turn. But that's still 80 hours. Even if he's like really sloppy, he's going to get his 180 in 80 hours, which will be, you know, if he plays a few hours a day, it'll just be, you know, a couple of weeks. So the 180 is psychologically kind of like a rite of passage in darts, and a lot of players see it as they're improving as very difficult. Tony teaches us this is not actually that hard. Okay, he doesn't aim. He gets it by luck. It takes him roughly 2,000 visits to have a 50% chance of a 180. So let's use this teaching of Tony to give us confidence. A lot of these lessons from Tony are here to bolster our psychology about darts. The 180 is a very accessible thing for people to succeed in. Okay, and what we also learned today from Tony, I think very importantly, is 2 things. One, please think about the 20 for scoring. I'm really into this idea. I'm going to make some more videos on it. Sorry, what did I say 20? I meant the double. Please think about the double 20, the tops for scoring. And the other thing we learned is that after a ton, scores higher than a ton kind of fall off the cliff in terms of being useful to Tony. His meat and potatoes is 60, 80, 100. And that teaches us something too about being very content with going for those hundreds consistently. So another long video, but this stuff is so cool, and I don't want to just give you some quick results without explanation, because I don't think that's worth very much. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for all your great comments. Massively appreciated. And we'll just keep going. I think there's at least 2 more to come in this 5-episode series. And so until then, 3 darts at the oche, make them count, and I'll see you next time.